What's up, guys? So today I have to talk about the xz-utils story. I actually wasn't sure I was going to cover this, but I think it's just too important to skip over. This is a huge backdoor risk that was attempted on the Linux xz-utils project. This is a huge project that I use almost daily to compress and back up ISO and image files. And it's pretty much on every Linux distribution. Did it reach the distributions? Well, thankfully not, because it was only in some of the newer files. So it wasn't actually put into the main and stable distributions. So one of the tips I have to you to avoid the potential for this, at least mitigated in some fashion, is to try and stick with stable Linux distributions. Avoid rolling release if you have concerns about something like this backdoor, because that is basically the distributions that were most at risk of this coming down first. So if you stick with a stable Debian, you will have a less of a chance of running into something like this. So that is one tip I do have on that, and apparently this backdoor was discovered by a Microsoft principal software engineer. They actually discovered it on a bit of accident, and they actually credit pure coincidence for discovering this. That's a bit scary in itself, and it really should cause us to question how many other problems like this could be hiding in Linux distributions, given that Linux is an open source endeavor, and we have code commits and kernel development coming from all different types of corporations from around the world, including Huawei and Microsoft and others who are also contributing to the Linux kernel. Speaking of the Linux kernel, let's take a look back at another Linux kernel backdoor attempt. Now, if we look at the Linux kernel backdoor attempt, this was a sly little trick here. If you note the code shown here, this is the key part that entered the root level. Basically, it would set the program's ID level, the user ID, the UID, to 0, which is actually root, which is the most privileged level on the system, full access. And they did this by calling it in this fashion. And so it was meant to simulate and look like a typo. So it looks like they accidentally wrote a single equal sign, and they accidentally wrote that instead of the double equals, which has an entirely different way of interpreting the code. So instead of checking a value, instead of that, it actually would set the value to the root level UID of 0. So that was a backdoor attempt way back when, and this article is from 2013, but I think it's very relatable to the subject at hand. Now back to the xz-utils backdoor, we can see the history of this backdoor attempt. We see that this wasn't an overnight project, and of course it wasn't just some teenager doing this. In fact, I believe it was at least a few different people that were involved in this project, and I'm going to break down why I believe that. So in 2021, Jia Tan signed up for GitHub. Now, for those who aren't familiar with GitHub, GitHub is where many open source projects choose to collaborate on the internet with people around the world. So if you have an idea and you have an improvement, you want to add some code to a project in the Linux distribution of your choice or otherwise, you can go on GitHub and you can contribute. That is the magic of open source, but it's also the danger of open source in that anyone can add anything, but not exactly. So when you have a project on something like GitHub or the Gitty Onion that I run and offer to the public, when you have something like that, you're in control if you create the repository. And other users can't just edit your code and change your program. They have to get actual access to do that. In fact, you have to approve of it, or you have to give them commit access to the repository. And if not, they will have to just submit things one by one. Now, how this individual worked on this, or this team, in my opinion, is they did it in a few years, period. And this is a social engineering endeavor. So what they did was they first signed up for the account 2021. Then they made their first commit in 2022. So they were really taking their time. They weren't rushing to get this backdoor in. And that shows patience and planning. And so we know it was likely a nation state. If not, I wouldn't doubt if it was some contractor related thing. Who knows what country? I'm not sure, but I will give some opinions on that as well in this video. So make sure to share this video and like it. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think. So you can see all of the different changes they made in the basics if you go to the xz-utils history, but you can see it right on this diagram to see where they added the malicious code and how they planned this. So they added and changed something called FOSS, which was actually something that helped to detect issues and malicious changes. And they actually changed that in order to prevent the backdoor from being discovered. So they did this in advance. So they were taking baby steps, little by little, a change here, a change there, something that on its own wouldn't seem like a big deal. But when you put everything together, it's a backdoor. Who did it? Now, let me give you some thoughts on that. So we have Gia Tan. Now, when you look at that name, what do you think? Well, you don't think English. We know that. When you look at that name, we think somewhere in Asia, right? That's what I thought. But when you're dealing with a nation state, a team on a nation state operation, the number one rule is plausible deniability. Now, how do they apply plausible deniability in operations? Well, what they will do is they will try to basically redirect your attention somewhere else. So it's a lot of distraction, a lot of spoofing of different values to make it appear like you are someone else. In fact, we can go over to the WikiLeaks Vault 7 and we can actually observe this for the CIA in particular. Now, do I believe the CIA did this backdoor? I don't. I don't have any evidence of that. But this actual paper on the WikiLeaks Vault 7 also can apply to any nation state. So you can take the information shown in this and you can assume that all nation states are doing something similar. So when you want to perform an operation but you don't want the attribution to come back to you, what do? Well, you change who you are. You also change the language, as it shows here in Vault 7, changing the code to Chinese, Russian, Korean, Arabic, or Farsi. That is something that was revealed in Vault 7 and something we knew before Vault 7 even came out, that nation states would commonly take a rival nation and then would try to lay the attribution on them by putting in things like their time zone, putting in things like their names or their language. Who did this? We're not sure. We don't know who did this, but we do know that if they were trying to redirect the attribution, they were trying to redirect it somewhere in Asia. Now, further research indicates that this individual had a time zone set for somewhere around Malaysia and also a VPN in the Malaysia area. Does it mean they were from Malaysia? Not at all. In fact, it's more likely they weren't. Or maybe with the Vault 7 releases, they learned from it and they said, why hide at all? And it could very well be somewhere in Asia. Could be that they realized that changing the language, changing the name was a common nation state operation attribution, and so they decided to stick with the one they had. So there's a lot of things that could be going on here, and what we know is whoever it is, they wanted it to appear that they were somewhere in Malaysia. Now we can take a look at other articles as well, and it looks like the individual who was the main maintainer before Gia Tan came along, Lassie Collin, was having some health issues and was stressed out about other things. It just brings to bear in mind that these open source projects, they really need our support. So if you have an open source project that you really love and you want to see stick around, I always encourage making a donation, even if it's a small donation. And if you don't have the finances to donate, send a compliment. Most of the time, open source developers are dealing with nothing but complaints, and that is discouraging. I can understand why so many of them give up on their projects, because people are more likely to complain than compliment. This is a hobby project. It's not paid. They're doing this on their own time, their own hours. They're dedicating their time to help out the community. And really, we should be doing all we can to support projects like this, because as we see in this individual dealt with the burnout, and with that burnout ended up handing over the commit privileges to Gia Tan. It didn't happen overnight. It happened through several different moves. They signed up early. They ended up making many compliments to the project developers, saying how great their translations were. I read a few of them, and it looked like they were really buttering them up. And what they did was they came out to be the most helpful person on that project, a project that possibly not that many people were involved with. And because they were so helpful, eventually, after a couple years, they got the privileges to actually make changes to it. And only because of the luck of the Microsoft engineer noticing the delay in their SSH connection were we able to even find out about this backdoor. Going over to the I2P browser, you can actually read Wired Magazine in I2P browser. So take a look at that if you have an I2P browser set up. And if you don't, make sure you take a look at my tutorials. I've done a ton of tutorials on I2P, and I plan to do more in the future. And if you want to browse anonymously, I2P is another great tool in your toolbox. So when we look at the story further, we can see a little more detail. This article just came out on the 3rd, so this was just yesterday that this article came out, and apparently it looks like it was a team effort. In my analysis, it was a team effort because Lassie Collin, the original maintainer, was driven by nagging emails sent by a handful of users complaining about how slow updates were. Now, who nags about xz-utils updates? I mean, are you really looking for a new compression feature? Really? Really? I think this could have been part of the whole operation. That's just my thought on this, because with social engineering, so many psychological avenues can be taken, and one of those is browbeating and beating down somebody, discouraging an open source developer. If you can do that successfully, you may have a chance of getting commit privileges. That is just the way the human psyche works. We have only so much patience. We have only so much dedication when we are unpaid volunteers that somebody can work on someone, especially when they have accomplices that were badgering this individual to get those privileges, to make those changes, because they know how vital the xz-utils project is to being a backdoor, in that it's used on so many operating systems. It would have come down the pipe and you would have had it on yours in the future if you run a Debian, an Ubuntu, or a Fedora, because those are the three I know of that were being targeted specifically, and there was work to get it pushed to those distributions. And if you're using a stable distribution, you do not even need to check. If you're using a rolling distribution, you may want to look further into this, but of course by now, make your upgrades and everything will be fixed. This isn't something that actually reached main distributions or anything, so I wouldn't get too worried, but I will tell you the very first thing I did when I read this story was I checked my version of xz-utils, just because, you just never know. And Russian cybersecurity firm Kaspersky gave their own input on this backdoor, and to state, I'd say this is a nation-state-backed group, one with long-term goals in mind that affords to invest into a multi-year infiltration of open-source projects, end quote. And For which nation? This Kaspersky employee named the usual suspects: China, Russia, North Korea. I think it's very probable it is one of those three. It could also, and they also mention, it could also be Iran or Israel. And that's a very real probability as well. You should take a look into some of these things, some of the different operations that have been performed by some of these countries, the cyber operations. There are some really fascinating stories on this. Some of the comments that Jia Tan was emailing in order to really ingratiate themselves into the project was writing in very concise and dry tones, and it reminded them of ChatGPT. Could these comments have been generated by AI? I would say in all likelihood it probably was, in that it's harder to attribute something when you don't have things like stylometry on your side, including the quote, "Nice job on both of you for getting this feature as far as it is already. Let me know your thoughts on these patches when you get a chance," smiley face. So this person was very friendly, very helpful to the project, and at the same time, we also had those who were beating down the maintainer using emails to basically complain about it not being updated enough. So while this person is sending all these emails that are basically beating down the maintainer for xz-utils, so really discouraging that developer, and at the same time they're trying to get in to get the privileges to make changes, and of course that maintainer saw it as an opportunity to help improve the project. So I do not believe the maintainer that was Colin, I do not believe they had any involvement in this. I believe they were social engineered into this. They also noted that there was zero trace of Jia Tan's email address outside of the messages for the xz-utils project. So it shows that this was an email created specifically for this operation to backdoor the xz-utils. What we're looking at now is a letter from Jia Tan to the translation team. So as you can see, they're really friendly and very helpful and seem very excited about the contributions to the xz-utils project. So this was a long-running effort in order to get themselves that access to be able to edit and to make commits to the project. So by sending out these letters, both friendly letters from Jia Tan, very helpful letters from Jia Tan, and at the same time, other users, different usernames, were sending emails to the maintainer to really beat them down and try and discourage them, and to also make them believe they needed the help of someone else. So this was a multi-pronged approach in order to infiltrate the xz-utils project. And my opinion is, it was likely a nation state, it was likely a team of individuals, and it could be using something like we saw in Vault 7 using different languages. So as we can see, this didn't happen overnight, and one thing I do notice is, if it were China, I find it interesting that we are seeing tons of comments trying to attribute it to the CIA. Now, it seems to be the Chinese community is posting these. Now, this could just be that they don't want a bad reputation in the development community just because they're from China. I can totally understand that, but it could also be, if it were in fact related to China at all, would there not be agents that would be posting trying to redirect that attribution to someone like the CIA? That's always a possibility. So we know, and what we've learned, we do know it was a multi-year approach. It was a multi-pronged attack with users complaining and discouraging the maintainer in order to ingratiate themselves, in order to infiltrate, to be able to get those commit privileges, in order to make those subtle changes that on their own didn't look like much, but all together created a major Linux backdoor. Make sure to share the video, like it, share, and subscribe, and leave a comment. Let me know what you think. Who do you think did this? Do you think it was China? Do you think it was the CIA? Do you think it was Israel? Could it be Unit 8200? Was it Russia? Was it Malaysia? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll be back later with more on how to protect your security and privacy.
How it's supposed to feel.